The marine oil terminal in Feodosia and 2 electrical substations were hit last night in temporarily occupied Crimea. According to our sources in the Security Service of Ukraine, the sponsors of this cotton were drones from the SBU Special Unit and the Special Operations Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. According to preliminary information, at least 5 long-range drones struck the oil terminal in Feodosia. A large-scale fire broke out. The strike on the Kafa substation, which is also in Feodosia, caused a power surge. This substation is a link in the energy bridge between Russia and Crimea. A series of explosions also occurred at the Simferopol electrical substation. As our sources in the Security Service of Ukraine emphasize, such strikes target the military, logistical and economic capabilities of the Russian Federation, and therefore they will continue. Starting in August, Ukraine's defense forces launched a new round of long-range strikes on energy infrastructure. More than 24 oil industry facilities have been hit in the Russian Federation, and Russia's losses in this sector of the economy have already broken historical records. According to various international organizations, between 25 and 38% of the aggressor country's oil refining capacity has been put out of commission, and clearly Ukraine does not intend to stop there. Recently, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, stated that Ukraine will scale up strikes on the enemy's logistics and fuel infrastructure. What could be the ultimate strategic goal of the strikes on oil refineries? Our journalists investigated this.
Fuel sold by coupons, limits on the number of liters per person, or even a complete lack of gasoline at gas stations, which leads to their closure. Until recently, this was a situation typical of the poorest countries in the world, and certainly not of Russia, a country often called a gas station nation, where, according to the International Energy Agency, 35 to 40% of all federal revenues are generated specifically from oil, gas and petroleum product income. However, dozens of successful attacks by Ukraine's defense forces on Russian oil refineries seem to have knocked the oil crown off Russia's head.
Oh, damn!
This is a map created by the documentarians of the OSINT project Tokni Accurate. It shows how, in just 7 weeks, the fuel crisis that began in the Far East has spread to almost all regions of Russia. As a result, fuel prices continue to rise steadily. The Russian authorities have already banned the export of petroleum products until the end of the year, and according to hostile media, are now planning to import gasoline and diesel from Belarus, China and Singapore.
They currently have a significant monthly gasoline shortage amounting to approximately 400,000 tons. As for diesel, at this particular moment in time, they are experiencing a noticeable shortage of about 100 to 150,000 tons, which is a considerable amount. Okay, but in reality, I think the shortage is a little smaller.
Are these consequences catastrophic for Russia, a country with such capacities and the ability to adapt to critical situations? Of course not. However, let's analyze what changes Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries could lead to if the current intensity of attacks continues, when almost every morning begins with a report about yet another refinery being hit. And finally, will this bring the end of the war any closer? First and foremost, one of the main reasons for Ukraine's regular attacks on Russian oil refineries is to halt the export of both crude oil and petroleum products, according to renowned British analyst and scholar Jamie Shea, who worked within NATO structures for over 35 years. According to him, it is precisely the sale of oil at prices significantly below market value that is one of the main sources of funding for the Russian war machine.
China is the largest consumer, India is the second largest, Turkey is also a consumer, as are other countries. So, as Ukraine strikes at the Russian energy sector, Putin is forced to redirect oil from exports to the domestic market to satisfy his drivers, his population. This will reduce Russia's oil revenues and limit its ability to finance the war. But we all know that Russia is a large country that obviously has a lot of resources.
For now, the effects of the fuel crisis are felt primarily by ordinary Russians, since the strictest restrictions today are related specifically to gasoline, which is used by most car drivers. With diesel, the fuel on which almost all of the enemy's logistics and military production are based, the situation for the Russians has always been much better, since they produce it in quantities twice as large as gasoline. And in order for the consequences of strikes on oil refineries to be felt by the Kremlin's war machine as well, analysts are convinced that strikes on diesel refineries must intensify.
If we're talking about diesel, it is potentially much more problematic in the medium and long term, especially if we also start successfully damaging the crucial facilities that process it, because diesel consistently generates significantly more foreign currency in the overall export structure, and accordingly, it is utilized much more actively and extensively in various sectors of industry and transportation. Therefore, this will undoubtedly have a far broader and more profound effect across the entire economy.
But if we analyze which oil refineries Ukraine has targeted over the past 2 months, we can see that most of the strikes were recorded in the European part of Russia at oil refineries that produce gasoline and, most importantly, are built using European equipment. And considering that some refineries have been hit multiple times, it becomes clear that Ukraine is trying to make the restoration of these oil refineries economically unfeasible for Russia, which in the long run could lead to their complete shutdown. And this really could become a catastrophe for the so-called gas station country, experts say.
They have more than 30 oil refineries, of which at least 15 to 16% need to be repaired or new ones need to be built. 15 to 18 refineries are currently partially idle. Just imagine, this is a very serious blow and it involves a lot of money. They will restore them, no doubt, and will purchase through China. So it will arrive, but it will be much more expensive. And it will also take much longer physically.
Most likely, the significantly bigger problem is the crucial ability to import or diligently attempt to import essential components for the extensive reconstruction of these vital refineries, since it's abundantly clear they have already completely exhausted their internal, readily available reserves of critical spare parts, and the remaining necessary components are unfortunately under strict sanctions, so they absolutely cannot freely purchase them at this time.
There is also an opinion spreading today that Ukraine's regular strikes on oil refineries could lead to a complete halt of the enemy's logistics. Although this is possible, it is nevertheless an overly optimistic forecast, and analysts are convinced that achieving this will be very difficult. 3.5 years of large-scale war have shown that Russia eventually adapts to many military threats. For example, they have already started covering some of their oil refineries with anti-drone nets. While this is a questionable defense against UAVs carrying warheads of several dozen or even hundreds of kilograms, it is at least a start. So it is quite likely that at some point they will find an effective way to counter drone attacks on oil refineries, and it will become much more difficult for Ukraine to achieve the desired results.
It is necessary to be able to sustain these efforts for several months or even years in order to maintain energy pressure on Moscow. Will this be the decisive factor in winning the war? Probably not. I still believe that victory over the Russian army will be achieved on the battlefield. But undoubtedly, this can put pressure on the Russian army. And this is also additional pressure on Putin and the Kremlin.
To completely halt the enemy's logistics, comprehensive solutions are needed, such as regular strikes on oil refineries as well as, for example, on major railway hubs. At present, it can be said with certainty that today's attacks on oil infrastructure are one of the most effective tools of economic pressure on Russia, an exceptionally effective sanction for which Russia has not yet found a way around. According to analysts, the fuel crisis will definitely continue for some time and will certainly provoke outrage within Russian society. However, just like in Soviet times, Russia will do everything possible to ensure that its elite, as well as Moscow and St. Petersburg, do not feel the shortage for as long as possible and do not make demands on the authorities.
There used to be sausage trains when everyone would travel to the city for food because supplies were available there, but not elsewhere. Most likely the same situation will occur with petroleum products. In other words, the overall supply volume to remote federal subjects will be reduced. Meanwhile, the central cities will continue to live as they do now, practically without any difficulties.
In the end, we can sum up. Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries have caused significant damage to Russia. And if the intensity and effectiveness of these attacks continue, things will become very difficult for the Russian terrorists. Because when a gas station state starts losing one of its main resources and comes up short by hundreds of thousands of tons of fuel, it means the direction of the war is changing. Yevhen Breiher, Alexander Chesnokov, Vikna, STB, United News.